Hello and welcome to a second episode of this revamped beginner tutorial. This is for absolute beginners. Super basic stuff going over here to learn Blender 3D modeling. Today I'm going to go over what's called the 3D view window. Now if you watched the first video, which you should watch, the first video I went over the whole interface, kind of window by window, showed you kind of the gist of what things do. Well, I want to kind of go into more detail on the 3D view window. This is the window that you use to model mostly. This is the one you see your model in. So this is one you use quite a bit. And I want to go over a lot of the basics here. Now first of all, you'll notice mine looks slightly different. I've got this black box down here. This is actually an add-on that'll show you the keys that I'm using. There's a couple examples right there. You can enable that as an add-on in the user preferences. So if you'll remember, this is called the 3D view window. It has a header along its bottom edge here. It's got a menu on the left side, and this menu can be toggled on and off by pressing the letter T. As you can see here, pressing T will turn on and off. There's another menu over here that you don't use very much, but you can use. You can toggle on by pressing the letter N over and over to toggle that one. And that's actually where the add-on for the Screencast Keys plugin, that's where you manage that. So that's where I would turn on this Screencast Keys. So a couple of notes here. We have an object. The default object when you start Blender is a cube, and it's literally called cube. You'll notice next to these global axes down here that kind of let you know what your orientation is, you'll see the 1 in parentheses and you'll see cube. Cube isn't necessarily the object, it's the name of the object, and you can change that name in your properties window, but we're not going to go over that today. So it's just the name, not necessarily the shape, though usually the two coincide. The 1 means the frame of animation in this bottom window here that you're on. So I'm on the first frame of animation, which if you're not doing animation is just the default. And I have a cube, an object named cube. That's the default object. I talked a little bit in the last video about this prism here being a camera. This is where you will render the scene from this viewpoint, and you can view that viewpoint by pressing 0 on the numpad. Now remember, if you don't have a numpad, you're going to have to go to user preferences and emulate the numpad. On that note, if you notice that it's not saving your preferences, you may have to check this option here under File called Save Startup File. After you set the preferences you want, it'll save a new file to start up as your default startup. So make sure that what I would recommend is starting a fresh, clean copy, opening up, going to user preferences, setting it up how you want in there, and then go back and save a new startup file. So it'll load up that new startup file every time. So this is your camera, this prism. On the numpad, if you press 0, it'll show you that viewpoint. This is what will be rendered, this box here, if we were to render the scene. I'll go over a little more detail about rendering in the next video. I think that's going to be the main topic. So to toggle that on and off, you use the numpad 0. So this other little thing in here, this long pole with the light on top, it's a lamp. We're not going to go over that at this time. We'll go over that probably in the next video, because you do need light sources to model. The light kind of sets the whole scene, the shadows, all of that. So we'll go over that next video, but for now don't worry about the light, don't worry about the lamp. Just worry about some of the options and what you see, like the objects in here. So you'll notice if you right click on the cube, it'll select the cube. Remember, right click is what selects. Left clicking will move your cursor, which starts out in the center. Quick note on your cursor. The reason why you don't want to really move it too much is because it's hard to position. Let's step back and think about this. I'm trying to, in a 3D coordinate system, project it onto a 2D screen. I'm trying to place a precise point in 3D, but I only can see 2D. My screen is only two-dimensional. So where I think this might be on the plane here, if I look at it, It's actually below the plane. And let's say I want to set something way back in this far corner here. Well, if I look at it, it's actually not in the corner, it's floating in the air up above. So you want to be careful setting the 3D cursor and always double check, because it really is kind of hard to do accurately because you're working with 3D on a 2D screen. So really try not to move that too much. If you do, it's not a big deal. You can always adjust for it later. You'll see these axes on the cube itself. This is something you can turn on and off in your options down here. This actually, if you right click on these arrows, it'll let you move in the direction of those arrows. This isn't the preferred method to do this. There's a much easier shortcut which I'll go over. But first I want to talk about those arrows. And if you go down to the header and you notice this little axis symbol with the 3 colored axes, this will turn those arrows on and off, and those are just for controlling various transforms. Now next to that you have the type of transform. The first one is just for movement. The second one with the curve is for rotations. So if I wanted to rotate the cube, I could use these now. And then the third one is for scaling, and this has, instead of arrows, it has cubes, and this will scale it up and down and make it bigger or smaller. Or if you want to turn those off, as is often the case, just because they tend to get in the way, just click that axes button and those options will go away. Or the shortcut key for that is Control Space to turn those on and off. Okay, so I'm going to turn mine off. They tend to get in the way. The next thing I want to talk about is, we already talked a little bit about these layers, these boxes over here. We'll get more into that in future videos. That's not important for now. Let's go over to the left. I'm not going to talk about this manipulate center points, quite honestly, because I don't know enough about it to explain it. But then we have a pivot center for rotation or scaling. Now let me demonstrate to you what this means. You have a few options here. You can set your pivot point as the default, which is the median point of the object. So that means when I rotate an object, for example, it will pivot around the median of that object, which is the center point. Let me show you an example. You can rotate a selected object by pressing R for rotation. Now notice it rotates around that orange dot, which is the object center point. Well, if I hit escape to cancel that, if I change the pivot point to the 3D cursor, which is up here, this little guy, and then I hit R, it'll rotate around the 3D cursor instead of around its own center point. That's just something you can use to kind of do some fancy rotations and transformations. Scaling can also work that way. If I scale with S relative to the center point, it just makes the object bigger or smaller. And I just hit S and I'm moving the mouse. Okay, so if I change it to 3D cursor and I hit S, it makes it bigger and smaller relative to that 3D cursor. So it's a little different, but it allows you to do some fancy things in more advanced modeling. The next one over is the Viewport Shading. What this means is how this box, or how your object, is going to look in the 3D view window. And the default is solid, which we'll use 90% of the time. You can also do wireframe if the faces are getting in the way. You can have texture if you've textured it, and you can also have rendered, which uses up a little bit more of the processing power, but it'll show you a quick and dirty preview of the object as it is rendered. Okay, this next one, object mode. This is a very important option here. There are different modes to working with objects here. The first one you'll find is object mode. If you press tab, it will switch between object mode and edit mode. Now edit mode lets you work with the vertices, or points as I will refer to them, the faces and the edges or lines. So you have points, lines, and faces, or vertices, edges, and faces. Edit mode lets you manipulate those. It lets you manipulate the mesh itself, or rather the points of the object individually, rather than as a whole object. So you'll notice in edit mode, I can only select the object, but if I tab into, or I'm sorry, object mode, I can only select the object. If I tab into edit mode, I can select single points. I have new options down here to select edges, or to select full faces. And this lets you do some interesting things as well. But that's just a quick preview of the difference between edit mode and object mode. When you're building a mesh, when you're working in detail to create your model, you'll usually be in edit mode. When you're working on your object as a whole, say doing specific properties and things like that, you'll want to be in object mode. It may be kind of confusing at this point, but we'll get into this again when we start making things. Now, you do have a few other options here. I'm not going to go into super detail on them. I do want to look through some of the tools on the left hand. You'll see you have these tabs. The top one is tools. You can translate, that would be move, rotate, scale. We already went over a couple of these, and if you hold your mouse over them, it'll actually tell you the shortcut key. So for example, translate is G, which I remember as grab. If I wanted to move this box, I could hit G and then it would follow my cursor. If you want to lock it to a specific axis in your movement, you can hit X to move it along the X-axis, Y to move it along the Y-axis, or Z to do it along the Z-axis. And you can hit escape if you don't want to move it after all. Rotate works the same way. You can rotate it about an axis or several axes. These X, Y, and Z again after pressing R. Now scaling, we already went over that as well. Pretty straightforward. That's S to scale, and it just follows your mouse however that is, and you can press escape to get out of that. And then a couple other things are, you can undo here, or you can let's pretend I scaled this and I scaled it way too big. I don't want a cube that big, so I can either come over here and click undo or redo, or I can just hit Control Z to undo. Yeah, Control Z is the default to undo, and then you can look at your history as well there. So the other thing you can look at, I know I'm skipping some of these, we'll get into useful ones as we're using them. You can add certain things, and you can access this menu in the 3D view window by pressing in object mode, by pressing Shift A, and that'll add. And you notice you have the same kind of menus on both this side over here and inside your context menu when you press Shift A. So you can add a mesh, which is a simple object. It's an object made up of points and lines and faces. Or you can add certain other special features like lamps, different kind of lighting, special curves, and some other things that help your object. I'm not going to worry about relations for now. I'm not going to worry about animation for now. I'm not going to worry about physics either. And grease pencil I never really use, but you can actually use it to draw notes. If this does not show up in the render, it does show up in the render. You can tell I don't use it a lot. But you can use it to draw quick and dirty lines, notes to yourself. Let's say I wanted to remember that this is cube 1, but I didn't want to change its name or anything like that. I don't know, just write notes, that kind of thing. You can use the grease pencil for. And then we have just a quick run through when you hit T to toggle that off, and then N to toggle this one on. This has a lot fewer. It doesn't have the tabs, but you can set the absolute location, rotation, and everything like that. So if your cube ever gets messed up, you can come back here and you can say, I want it to be at 0, 0, 0. And I want its rotation to be 0, 0, 0. Scaling, you can fix all that right here. You can disable grease pencil if you want in here. And you can just generally set some things like your 3D cursor. If that's way off, you can reset that back to the origin, which is 0, 0, 0. That's the very center. You can do things like that over here. This has some more absolute stuff on this side. The Screencast Keys, like I said, is a plugin. And you can also set a thing called background images, which lets you set up an image in the background of the 3D view window to help you model according to a reference image. We'll get into that in another tutorial. I have a good tutorial for that. But that's to the gist of using the 3D view window. Now for the practical stuff. What you want to do for this is we want to get into edit mode, but we want to get rid of our cube. So if we delete our cube in object mode, which you can hit X to delete once you have it selected, we can't tab into edit mode anymore because we don't have anything to edit. So a little cheat is to tab into edit mode on the cube and then just delete all of the vertices for the cube. And we're still editing the object cube. It still exists, but it no longer has any vertices. And that's just a quick and dirty way to be able to make a simple mesh very quickly without having to worry about making a new object. So what you can do is you can adjust the views of your 3D view window with the numpad keys. Each view, 1, 3, 7, and I want to say 9 does not. So 1, 3, 4, 6, and 7 all are different views. And I think 1, 3, and 7 are the ones I use most often, especially 7, because 7 is a top-down perfect view. You notice it lines you up exactly according to the z-axis going in and out of the center. And that's useful for what we're about to do. And then a quick note, if you can obviously zoom in and out with the mouse wheel. I showed you guys that in the previous video. But just a quick reminder, zooming is mouse wheel. If you control mouse wheel, it'll move the screen left and right. If you shift mouse wheel, it'll move the screen up and down. I don't recommend using those unless you need them because it tends to get the screen off center and then it's hard to keep track. Now, what I want you to do is draw a mesh. Hit 7 on the numpad to make sure you're in this perfect view. It makes it a lot easier to draw. And then what you can do is hold down Control and draw point by point a simple shape. And if you keep holding down Control and don't let go of Control, when you're left clicking here, it'll connect the points with these lines automatically as you draw them. Now the trick here is not to close the final loop. I don't want to try to connect that back here. And the reason for that is because I will end up with a duplicate dot or a duplicate vertex right on top there. If I put one there, I'll end up with 2 there, and I don't want 2 there, I just want the 1. So the way to connect them is to make a face using them. To select multiple, hold down Control and right click the ones you want. Did I do that wrong? I did. It's Shift. Hold down Shift and right click to select multiple. So for example, I'll select one, hold down Shift, select another, holding down Shift still, select another, and you can select them again with the right mouse button. Now to make a face, you can only make a face You should only make a face with 3 or 4 points if you know what you're doing. And then you just hit F with the points selected to make a face out of them. Why do we need faces? Well, faces are actually the only thing that is rendered when you render the scene. So if I'm going to make a model, the only thing I really see is the lighting and how it bounces off of the faces, and then the textures and things like that. But what I mean is the points and the lines are not rendered at all, only the faces. So we want to fill all of this in, and I'm going to go through point by point, excuse me, and I'm going to make faces out of each of these. So I will right click on one corner, hold down shift and select the other 2 corners, and then press F to fill in that face. And I'm going to do that with all of these triangles. Remember, I just want to do triangles or quadrangles for faces. Otherwise it gets a little bit crazy, and you don't want to worry about anything higher than 4 sides. Now this last piece I'll do is 4 sides. And fill that in with a face. So I've got this filled in. I've got my first mesh, my first object. It's a star. I'm a terrible artist, and it looks like a very bad star. However, I can still edit it because it's right here and it's available to be edited. I can click on a point that I want to move, press G. Remember, that's the shortcut for transforming or moving. So press G, and then it'll follow my mouse where I want to move it. Now, since I'm in a perfect view, only top down, so I only have these 2 dimensions, I don't have to worry about where I move it unless I want to lock it to an axis, but it won't really be affected by the Z-axis, the in and out axis, because that axis is kind of removed due to the view. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust these points using the G key or the transform key. And I'm going to fix my star a little bit so it looks a little more like a star should look. And while I'm doing that, feel free to make a shape of your own. Make something, anything really, it doesn't really matter what you make, as long as you can make it in 2D to start out with. That's the easiest way to do it. And we'll go with something like this. I think that looks like a decent star. Not the best star in the world, but it's okay. Now, if I look and I zoom out and then I rotate the view, it put me all those points right on the grid. Sometimes it will put the points below the grid, I've seen, but it put mine all on the grid. And keep in mind, I can still move them in other directions. So once I get out of that perfect view, I can select a point, I can hit G, and I can try to move it around, but see how it's hard to tell it where exactly to go with this view? What I can do is I can hit Z and just pull all of these corners up, which is kind of a cool thing on a star. Just hit G to grab, hit Z to lock it to the axis, and I can move all of these corners up by grabbing them, locking the Z-axis, and then I have this 3D shape now, as you can see. And if I want to see what it renders like, remember, I just hit 0. It's not the greatest lineup in the camera, but gives you an idea. And if I wanted to scale it, I can hit A. A will deselect everything, or it will select everything. So it toggles between selecting everything and deselecting everything. If I have one point selected and I hit A, it will deselect everything. If I have nothing selected and I hit A, it'll select everything. And then I can hit S and I can scale, make it really big. I can, while I have the whole thing selected, hit G, move it all up right to there. And if I can't tell, I can use the numpad 1 to go to a perfect view where I can see the axis and more perfectly line it up there. And then let's say I wanted to rotate this. I would hit R, and I would probably want to lock it to an axis. And we'll just flip it upside down. So you can actually type in the numbers if you want while you're scaling, while you're transforming, or while you're rotating. So I'm going to try 180 while I have this, and you'll see down in this bottom corner, bottom left corner of the 3D view window, it'll actually say what you typed to confirm. So 180 degrees, and I hit enter. And then I want to scale it down just to show you, and I'll type 0.1. I can hit backspace. 0.9, just to small scale it. Hit enter, and then let's grab it and move it along the z-axis 0.5. Negative, and hit enter. I'm just showing you guys some weird ways you can move things and arrange things. This is just an intro to how things can be moved, transformed, and played with in this window. So I think I'm going to wrap up there. You should, after this video, have a basic grasp on how to, number one, manipulate the 3D view window. Number two, add a mesh using either Shift-A to add, and that'll add on where the 3D cursor is. Or you can hit T and go over to create, and you can add things from here. You should know how to delete things, either the entire object in object mode, or you can delete point by point in edit mode. You should know how to select with A. You should know how to translate, rotate, and scale with those shortcut keys, and also to undo if you made a mistake with Control Z. Now, the next video, what we'll do is we will look at a little bit of the rendering process, what goes into that, how you guys can render some of these things, so that as we go through the tutorials, you'll be able to show this off to your friends and family to say, hey, look what I made, and they won't have to look at your program here to see what you're making, but you can actually edit it with lighting and with how you want it set up to the camera to come out as a nice picture. So we'll go over that a little bit in the next video. For now, you should have a grasp on the 3D view window, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them. A couple of things I did not go over are some of these other modes, such as Sculpt Mode and Texture Paint, Weight Paint, Vertex Paint. These are a little more advanced things. For now, we're going to stick with Object and Edit Mode. Yeah, if you have questions, post in the comments. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.